Okay, I guess we'll get started. Um, it's amazing we have exactly the right number of people. There's like one chair empty in the back, so it's just perfect. Although there's like 67 seats in here, and there's 101 people on the spreadsheet, so that's a little mysterious. So that's the first order of business. Hopefully everybody noticed that I put up the homework that you're going to be doing. So if you go to the homework page, then homework 1 is listed. And it talks about, in very great detail, what you're supposed to start doing with this device that we're going to make sure everybody has a good version of. And one of the key things I wanted to point out, is that in a real contextual inquiry, you would try a lot of people, you try a lot of different tasks. We really don't have time for that. This is a hard enough assignment as it is. It's probably the hardest of all the assignments. And so you just have to do one person. And the goal is to do somebody who's going to have a lot of problems. So you'll want to find an older person, somebody who's unfamiliar with your device. But if they don't find problems, if they don't have trouble doing stuff, then you really won't be able to do this assignment. So the reason I'm bringing up this now is that many people picked apps that were really simple to use. And it's highly likely that you can't come up with any tasks that are actually difficult. And in which case you'll need to pick a harder device or a harder task on that device or a harder app or something like that. So I pretty much approved most of those and left a comment next to them, as you'll see if you go back to your entry, and said, you can try this, but if it turns out to be too easy, you might want to pick something else. So it says very clearly here that if you cannot find anyone who has trouble with the tasks, you either find a user who doesn't know as much so that they can have problems, or you can switch devices to something that's harder to do, or you can pick a harder task or something with the device. Okay, so I just wanted to introduce that now so that you know when we go through the devices why I'm saying that some of the things probably are too easy. So what I want to do is really quickly go through this entire list, make sure everybody's clear on what's going on. So for example, the Mint app on the iPhone, I'm not really familiar with the Mint app, but if it turns out to be too easy, you might want to pick something else. And if you need to pick something else, that's fine. You can email me and the TAs that you're doing that. You can update it here in the spreadsheet. But because you're picking late, you have to make sure nobody else above you, nobody else in the entire class has picked what you're going for. But it seems like there's plenty of other things that people could pick. The TripAdvisor website. So obviously TripAdvisor does all sorts of different things. So you'll have to be a little more specific in your tasks. What in particular? Is it looking up some restaurant information or booking a trip or whatever? Built-in music player is fine, assuming it's hard enough. And this person, whoops, this person's actually gone. So wait, we're in the wrong place. Sorry. ATM of PNC Bank. One of the problems with that is, let's start over. The Notes app in the iPhone is really easy to use. There's not much you can do with it except for typing. So typing is really not in scope so much if somebody has trouble typing. And native calendar app, Gmail app, again, all of these are kind of simple. It'd be better to pick something more difficult. ATM of PNC, again, you don't want to make the person, take out money so that they can always cancel at the last step. So they don't necessarily have to do stuff. They may not be willing to reveal to you their actual credit balance or statement balance or whatever. And again, the ATM is designed to be as easy as possible. You may turn out that even an elderly user has no trouble using it, in which case you might want to switch to something a little more complicated. Mind Body app, again, I don't really know what that is. Is this person Go Zinzi? This person's here. Didn't pick anything. Windows accessibility function, Canon. So all these are fine. The Giant Eagle checkout system. I mean, the main problem, there's like one chair over there. The main problem I had with the Giant Eagle checkout system is when it fails to scan something, which isn't really a design issue with the device itself. So that may or may not turn out to be appropriate. I'm sure this television is really complicated, and that might make more sense. So you might want to switch. Yelp, again, might be too easy. Digital camera, including taking pictures, specifying different resolutions. So as Shuang Su here? Yeah. So somebody else picked a Canon camera. What kind do you have in mind? What's your camera?
I don't think it's Canon.
Okay. So go look at your camera and fill in what brand. As long as it's not a Canon, it'll be fine. Sharon Lynn, are you here? So hopefully these people are planning to drop. Otherwise, they're going to have to pick something. Laptop interface, again, that's too vague. I mean, laptops have lots of interfaces. Typing, mouse, really not a big issue. Google Map app is a little vague, also really easy to use. iPhone, the Twitter application. So, this theme of being too easy repeats over and over again. Google Camera app. Amazon mobile application. So buying something is usually pretty tricky, going through the shopping cart and all those kind of things. So that may certainly turn out to be more complicated if just browsing around to find something to buy is probably too easy, but it's certainly possible that the shipping address and all that kind of stuff for an unregistered user might be complex enough. Piazza, which reminds me, I was thinking of actually using Piazza for this class. Have you guys used Piazza? Do you want me to set that up? Yeah, I think that might be useful. So I'll try and set that up tonight. Is June Wang here? No? Okay. Microsoft Surface tablet keypad and support. That seems kind of trivial, although maybe it has a complicated setup that I'm not familiar with. I don't have a Surface. So if it's really a complicated thing about, using one finger or two fingers or whatever, that may be okay. But just kind of generic typing and using the mouse pad is probably too easy. Yelp, somebody actually picked that above. So when you're picking something, be sure to look up above to make sure no one above you has already picked what you're pointing to. iPhone for placing calls, after 10 generations or whatever we've gone, it's, probably pretty trivial to do. So I'm not too optimistic that will be hard enough. A bunch of people wanted to do the PNC mobile app, but only the top person gets to use it. iPod, yeah, sure. Okay, so the LinkedIn, did somebody pick LinkedIn? I don't remember. So the LinkedIn app might be a better choice. Milestone Pod, I don't know what that is, or what you can do with it, or how you configure it. But the ones in red are basically I'm a little concerned about. Gmail, iMessaging, that seemed too easy. And we're really not dealing with just plain old typing and how hard typing is. So I would imagine most of messaging is about, typing in somebody's name and then typing in your message. And that's really not going to be very interesting. So it's mostly about things that require configuration, things that require filling in lots of dialogues and stuff like that. So if you go back to the requirements page, to homework 0, we talked about that it has to be a reasonable level of complexity, like 10 different pages, 10 screens of information that you have to fill in, about 30 controls that you have to click on in the right order. Okay, it doesn't count the 30 keys on the keyboard. That's not the point, right? So So hopefully this gives you a sense of the level of complexity. So it's kind of reasonably complex and reasonably hard to use so that people will have trouble with it. At least a couple of people really didn't like the Indian Railways site, so that'll probably be fun. Is this person here Nucala? No? Because, okay. 163 music mobile app? I don't know. Spitwise. Did somebody pick that already? Is this you? Okay, so this person, yeah, I thought that sounded familiar. So, QR reader app. I think that's probably too easy. And then self-checkout, we just did that one. So that would probably be really hard unless it's a, so is this person here? Navnika Watson, are you here? Okay. So, okay, Jeep, build and price tool, okay. So this person picked one task on a watch, which is probably too easy, but if you do a collection of watch tasks, that'll probably be complex enough. PNC, again, somebody already did that. Here's a couple of people who aren't here, I guess. Prina Balara or Jingzi Hu. Kadake Sahe. Oh, you're here? Oh, okay. That's handy. Okay. Yeah, so Keaton Watts, are you here? Yeah. So, Craigslist, it does a million tasks. Which ones are going to be hard enough to count? So you might be able to pick a specific task on Craigslist if you really want to do that. Posting an ad, is that complicated enough to warrant people making trouble? Okay. I mean, especially if you start with an unregistered user, so they have to make their, describe all their information and things like that, that may be reasonable. Certainly Blackboard is really hard to use. If somebody wanted to pick that one up. But I will go back and you can fill in the something like that. Okay. Mobile app was already picked. Starbucks app is probably too simple. Joseph Gibble, yeah? Do you have a better idea or?
Again, there's like two separate PNC mobile apps. There's a virtual wallet.
Okay.
And there's just like one for general accounts.
Okay.
So that's like one thing.
Okay.
But like the Starbucks app also has like a bunch of different functions as far as like signing up to be a user
Okay.
and like sending stuff.
So nobody above him did the general app, just the virtual wallet? So would you prefer to do that one?
Yeah, I can roll it down.
Okay. Okay. And some websites, Speak Up Personal IDear, Sahil Shah, yeah?
I'm working on my own idea, so I wanted to pick that up. That's why I wanted to speak to as well. I made you about it.
So does it work now?
I'm building it right now. That's why I was wondering if I can take it.
So the interesting, the first assignment, you have to evaluate an actual working system. And then for the rest of the assignments, you're going to invent a new user interface. So the question is, can you think of an existing app or system that's close enough to what you have in mind so that you could test them on your competitor site for real for task 1, and then for tasks 2 through 6, you can try to design your interface? Something like that? Okay, so you can't put somebody in front of a site that doesn't work or an app that's not ready yet. In homeworks 2, 3, and 4, and 5, and 6, we'll actually be creating prototypes. And obviously, you can create a prototype of a system that doesn't exist. But for the first one, we need something real. So if you can think of something else that can substitute for it, that would be fine. Movie schedule mobile app application. Okay, presumably it's hard enough to use. I think this one would probably be too easy, which is why I didn't highlight it. We did this one already, right? And so the manner, that's why I skipped it, and we did the ride one. I think this is tiramisu, which somebody picked, I think, above it. So Sissy Zai, Shu, Z? Okay. Which is the what? Oh, you have a fourth idea. Okay. Okay. So you can do that one. I don't know what that is, but that'll be fine. Here's another blank line. So blank lines are from people who already dropped. Reese Moser? No. Sky Yin? So presumably these people just haven't gotten around to dropping yet. Swapnil Bonsai? Okay. Megabus. That would be fun. Yeah. Future tenant is a museum. I don't know what you would do with that. So Radhinka Ravindranath, yeah? Okay. Okay, and these guys are doing a startup. So I guess the question for Nick and George is, do you have something now that you can put people in front of? Okay, great. That's great. Okay, and it'll be different? You'll do the different parts for now? Okay, great. So it's fine to do things that, if you have a startup or some cool system that you've already made, as long as you can put people in front of it for homework 1, that's fine to use. Okay, any questions about what's going on with this or assignment 1? Okay, so the next 2 lectures, this lecture and the one on Monday, are going to go over in detail how to do assignment 1. It's probably the longest assignment, and it's also one of the most useful skills to know how to do. Because it's all about understanding users' needs and appreciating how hard it is for users to do things. So let's get started. Discovering what people can't tell you. So this, most people think that the right way to find out things is just to ask your customers. And unfortunately, it turns out that doesn't work very well in a lot of cases. So as I mentioned in the first lecture, if you were to become an HCI master's student, you would learn dozens of methods that are helpful in evaluating user interfaces, in designing user interfaces, and in understanding users' needs. And obviously, in a 6-week, 7-week course, we can't do justice to any reasonable number of these. Some of these have cute names. What we're going to do in this course is the first 5. We're going to try and teach you these that we consider the most important, the most useful, the easiest to learn, and the ones that are most commonly used by HCI professionals and other kinds of engineers who want to design things. So you'll learn all about those in depth. The blue ones I'll cover in the last lecture to just kind of give you an idea what they are and why they're interesting and important. And then there are a bunch of other ones that we'll cover to some extent or mention in passing. A versus B studies is the kind of thing everybody thinks of when you think of usability tests, which is where it's kind of like a psychology experiment where you put half the people in one version and half in the other version, you see which one is better. It turns out that that's almost never used. in usability in real life, in real companies, because who cares if something else is better than the one you're trying to design? You just want to make the one you're trying to design better itself, right? So you don't need to know that it's 30% worse in order to make progress. Questionnaire, surveys, you probably learned about these in other classes, focus groups. All of these are really perfectly valid and useful methods, and in fact, you'll do a little bit of survey as part of this assignment in order to understand people's backgrounds. Things like card sorting are pretty useful if you want to organize material and understand how people organize things, and so forth. Speed dating, it's a cute name. The idea is that instead of dating a person, you're dating ideas. I don't know, it seems kind of silly to me, but the general idea is that you have a lot of ideas for what the system might do, and you put them in front of your users quickly, right? So here's an idea, tell me what you think of it in 10 seconds. Okay, here's another idea, another 10 seconds. And so it's basically to try and get a sense of what resonates with people, given that you have lots of ideas all over the place and you can't really decide. So the point of this list is not to be discouraged that you don't learn all these methods, but to understand that kind of for any question that you have as a product manager, as a usability specialist, as a designer or an engineer, if any question you have about people, there's probably an appropriate method for getting an answer. So rather than just imagining the answer or trying to guess, to the extent that you have resources or an HCI specialist or even a textbook around, you could probably whip up one of these methods fairly cheaply and actually get an answer that you can then use as data for guiding your designs. So the contextual inquiry and contextual design and analysis is the first one that we're teaching. It's the topic of homework 1. And it's been very successful as a way of understanding people's real needs, which is why we teach it first. It's covered in chapters 3 through 6 of the book. Probably chapter 6 is the most important of those because it actually tells you how to do the homework. And we're going to be basing the homework off of the design in chapter 6. It's based on this classic book. So Beyer and Holzblatt are some senior people in the field who really wrote the book on how to do this technique. And we use this book in the master's course. It's slightly different. So if you're familiar with this book or if you go ahead and buy it, the ones that we're using from the Hartson and Pila book are slightly different. So I've told all the TAs to make sure that they grade you based on the Hartson textbook. And so the way it's described in the lecture notes, in the lectures for today and Monday, is the way you're supposed to do it, which is the same way as the Hartson book. So contextual inquiry is kind of an ethnographic approach. That means you're studying people in their natural habitats. So you might think of ethnography as more about, visiting, or anthropology, right, as visiting people in Africa or, finding Aborigines and understanding their culture. But it turns out that all those methods are also used for modern culture. And so ethnographers study companies, they study Facebook, they try to understand culture and how people relate to each other. And so this method of contextual inquiry actually comes out of methods for understanding how people relate to each other and how people relate to things, artifacts. And those things can be information products like web pages. And so there's a lot of methods from these fields of social sciences that are really useful for understanding people. And contextual inquiry, as you'll see, combines a number of other methods. So it includes interviewing. It includes what are called think aloud protocols, as we'll see. And that means that while your user is doing stuff with your device, you're going to try and understand what they're doing, why they're doing things. And so you're going to ask them to tell you. So if they're confused, you're going to say, what are you confused about? Right? And so that's called think alouds because you get them to talk. And it's also, in some sense, participatory design, which means you're getting your users to help you design the system that you're trying to make. So to the extent that the user is confused about something, you might ask them, well, what would be a better design where you wouldn't be confused? You have to remember, of course, that your user is not a designer, so they may come up with bad ideas about the design. So you don't necessarily, if the user says, well, I really love green text on red backgrounds, you'll say, thank you for telling me that, and you'll make a note of it, but you won't necessarily do that because that would be a really bad idea. So on the other hand, the fact that they can't read the text in front of them because of bad color choice or because it's poorly designed, that is an objective fact that you can take advantage of. So this is an interpretive field study method. So you would go out into the field and try and understand what people are really doing. In a real contextual inquiry, which we unfortunately can't really do in this class, you would actually find somebody who actually has a problem and watch them while they have the problem. Right? And so instead of what we're doing in this device, in this course of taking your device and putting it in front of somebody and saying, here, try and do stuff, you would actually find people doing it for real as part of their job or as part of their entertainment or whatever the device is used for. And so the key point is that this would then reveal the real requirements. What do they want to do with this? What are their barriers? What's causing them problems? So the context, why is this called contextual inquiry? And the point is to try and get at all of these features, the interrelated conditions within which something occurs or exists. So no device or software product or web page is ever used in isolation. If you're using Expedia to make flights, then you're probably coordinating that with your calendar. You're probably coordinating that with other people. So if you're going on vacation with your spouse, you have to deal with what your spouse's schedule is as well as your schedule. Or if you're going to go home for Christmas, then you don't necessarily want to arrive at midnight on Christmas Eve because somebody else has to pick you up. So there's all sorts of other information, other influences on why and how you use products. And so part of contextual inquiry is to try and understand all these other things that are affecting how you use products. So you want to understand the work in its natural environment so that you get to observe the context and try and collect real examples of what people are doing and what they're doing it to. We use the word artifact a lot, and that's a kind of general term for anything the user sees or creates or uses as part of the process. So in this talk and the next one, we'll talk about artifacts in terms of like web pages. So the artifact is the page that you can see on the screen. If you're doing a camera, then the artifact is the camera and all the buttons and knobs and touchscreen and all that kind of stuff. So if you're studying an office environment, then it would be the table and the chairs and the lighting and anything around that's a physical or a screen thing that is involved in doing this process. So all of those might be interesting and relevant. It turns out that watching people actually do stuff is way more effective and informative than asking them. Because there's a property in psychology called salience. It means what you pay attention to, what you notice. So we did a study a while ago where we were looking for programmers and why they weren't more efficient, what was slowing down programmers. And we had them do a task in the lab for an hour and a half. And we measured every single keystroke that people did and wanted to know, what they were spending time on. And of course, we asked them, what were you wasting time on? What was difficult? And they told us, understanding this code was hard and this bug was really hard to do. When we looked at the data, they were wasting 1/3 of their time scrolling, navigating poorly, right? And so nobody said, my biggest problem, my biggest time waster was scrolling, because that was just not something that they noticed, because they didn't pay attention to it, because they always are scrolling. right? And people would scroll up and couldn't find it and scroll back down and scroll up again. And by actually watching the actual activity that people are doing, it really jumped out to us that this was a really big waste of time that people were doing. And we could make people 30% faster by putting a better mechanism for getting to the places they wanted to get to. So that's just one example of how people won't necessarily come up with the thing that's really most important if you just ask them. And so the key point of contextual inquiry is to actually go and watch people do their real things, right? If you ask people what's the hardest thing about using Amazon, they're probably not going to remember that on page 3 there's a label that's really confusing, and so they always fill it in wrong. But if you make them actually do the tasks, then they'll, that will jump out at you as a breakdown. So understanding people and artifacts and activities in the real context is crucial. And it can happen, if you're building a product for work, then obviously you want to watch them in a work context. But if you're building a product for leisure, that doesn't mean you can't observe it. You just would, have a different situation in which you try and get people to do the activity. And it doesn't mean you just kind of walk up to somebody and say, oh, let me watch you, right now while you're using this app or whatever. It's often reasonable. Like one of my students was doing some observation of programmers, and so he put on a mailing list, anytime you happen to be working on a new bug, on unfamiliar code, give me a call and I'll rush over and watch you, right? Or please pick a task to do right now in which you would engage in this part of the user interface, right? And so you let them pick their own tasks, but it doesn't mean that you just have to wait around until they happen to come across it or something. Or if you were doing a new camera and you were interested in what sort of problems people were having with their current camera, you could talk to either professional photographers or novice photographers, whatever you were interested in. You would say, let's go out to the park next time you have some time and watch while you try and take some pictures, or whatever. So it doesn't mean that you have to necessarily wait for the real activities to happen. You're certainly allowed to direct them. But the point is that you watch them in the real place where people usually do this task. You let them pick the tasks that are relevant to them, and you watch for all these kinds of breakdowns and issues to appear on their own. So what are you interested in? Why do you have to go to all this trouble to watch them in context? Well, you want to look at where this activity happens. Sometimes it's pretty irrelevant. If it's a laptop, you can use a laptop kind of anywhere. But like somebody's going to look at the Giant Eagle checkout place, and obviously there's a whole bunch of structure there. Where do you put your stuff? The bagger is always complaining about not putting the item in the right place after you scan it, right? And that's very much relevant to the physical location. Or there's not enough room for all of the stuff after I've tried to start bagging it. Where does it go? And so the workspace in that was very important. Another example is we did a study of doctors who study x-rays, radiologists, and they have a very specific workstation where they look at the x-rays and a mouse in a particular place, and all the doctors were getting RSI, which is wrist problems because of the way everything was organized and the way they had to use the mouse. And the new reports that they had to deal with were coming in over here, and then they had to work on them here, and then they put them over there. And so the actual physical location had a big impact. So for some things, the physical location is really important. In terms of this assignment, we've said not to worry about it unless it's relevant. So for the vast majority of your devices, it won't be relevant, but the people doing Giant Eagle or doing an ATM, it may be more important to understand the workspace. Obviously, you want to understand the work. What is it that people are doing? What are the tasks and the requirements for their tasks and things like that. Another really key thing is workarounds, right? So often systems don't work as intended or as desired, and so people will figure out techniques to make things happen that are not what the designer necessarily intended. And so anything that's something like that is obviously really valuable. Intentions are useful to understand. Why are people doing things? What is it that's motivating people to do this task? What's important about the task to people? What do they value? Is it high quality? Is it speed? Low price? What are they trying to achieve when they're doing these tasks? Another key thing is, what do people call stuff? So if any of you have ever designed anything, any user interface, or even if you're trying to write a book or something, what words should you use for everything? And it's especially true in technology products. What are the labels? What should this label be? What does it mean? What should I say in the help text or in the error message? What should I refer to? Right? And so some fields have very specific names. So like photography has f-stops and ISO numbers and all these specialized words, which if you're doing a camera for professional photographers are going to be really important. But if you're doing a camera for the consumer market, maybe you don't want to use those words. And so thinking about your target audience, what do they call things, is very important. And obviously that includes understanding who your target audience is, right? And so lots and lots of problems with using interfaces result from not using the right words, not understanding the user's language. What sort of tools do people use? So in addition to using your product, what else do they use? Or whatever you're trying to analyze, what else is used around them? So do they use spreadsheets? Do they use calendars? What other kinds of information? Email. Does emails come in about the topics and stuff? People working together. So almost all things that we're talking about in this class are for individuals to use alone. But nothing in terms of work or leisure is, well, some things in leisure are alone and some things in work are alone, but most things are in the context of all the other people around, right? And how does that coordination happen? How does the information flow back and forth? For work products, you have to think about business goals. What is this business that we're trying to sell our product into value? Are they going to want a playful product or are they going to want a serious product? Do they want it to be absolutely as efficient as possible for expert users, or do they want the learning curve to be easier? So what does that company value? What does your company want to project as your values? Are you a playful company or a really serious company? So different companies have very different profiles, and you might want to try and capture that in your observations. So we talked about this to some extent. A lot of products are very perfectly reasonable when you think of them in isolation, but no real products are used that way. What is it about other products that you have to worry about? Well, one thing is consistency, right? So if your product is almost always used with Excel, and Excel has one format for dates and yours has another one, or Excel has one way of dealing with how things are selected, and yours has a totally different way of selecting things, well, then people are going to continually get confused, right? And so the extent to which you can understand the context and the other operations that people are doing at the same time as they're using yours, then you can achieve a consistency and it'll be much more effective. It'll seem more coherent because everything will work together exactly as people would expect. I've been in lots of design meetings where there are lots of arguments. Anybody here been in design meetings? How many people have? Most people have been in companies? No? I thought so. So one of the big problems with design meetings is typically people have different opinions about how the design should go, or people may disagree with their boss or with other people. And so how do you know what to pick? So an obvious answer is the most senior person gets to pick, which isn't necessarily the right answer. So the goal of a lot of the methods that we're talking about in this class is to give you actual data, where you can design from data. And you can point to the more senior person and say, look, you may have an opinion, but I have data that shows that my way is a better idea, right? And it's really very powerful to be able to show that it's not just my opinion, but really we can know from doing this user study that people have problems with the way you're proposing it, and the way I'm proposing it is going to be less problematic. And you also, if you're in a company and you're ready to do version 3.2 of a product, what are the new features you should add, right? And the marketing department's going to say, here's some new things, implement all of these. So you end up with a list of features, how are those going to be used, which ones are really important. You really don't get any of that kind of information unless you really understand the user's needs. And so a lot of the results from the contextual inquiry helps you understand what is really needed, so it's a lot different than just a list of features. And this is a really, question?
I had a question about consistency and also the language used, you mentioned before. So what happens about, let's say, new features that you're introducing that nobody else has used? Let's say when check-in came in, I mean, you obviously created a language there.
Right. So the question is, and I'm repeating the question for the video and for the remote people in case they can't hear. Suppose you're building a new product, and what are you consistent with? How do you get the language right? What do you do about inventing something brand new? And this is going to come up a lot of times in a lot of parts of this, this course, because that happens fairly regularly. Well, number one, rarely are you trying to really make something that no one's ever heard of. It's usually replacing a manual activity with an automated activity or a computer-based activity. And like we were saying here, nobody's inventing something that doesn't exist with other things, right? So people are used to using Word, they're used to using games, they're used to using Excel, whatever domain your product is in, there are going to be a bunch of other things that people are familiar with in that same domain. And how does that language, is that relevant to what you're doing? And obviously, if you're kind of talking about a new domain that was previously paper-based, then a lot of these words that people come up with are analogies to the original version, right? So in the Macintosh, there was a trash can because they were pretending that it's analogous to throwing away a piece of paper. And I think you said check-in, like for an airline. Obviously, people have always checked into airlines. And before that, they checked into trains, and who knows where the name came from. You can look it up on Wikipedia or, OED or whatever. So there's this word from real life that you can appropriate to use in your application, and then people will know what it's for. And to the extent that you have an idea for this new app, there's a technique we use a lot, which we call natural elicitation. And the idea is that you try and describe your idea in a way that doesn't give away the names you're thinking of, sometimes with pictures. And you go to some users and say, what would you call this? Right? And so you have an idea, you try and describe it in pictures or by analogy without giving away the names. If you say, what would you call when you check into an airline? And they say, what do you call it? It's check-in. Why would I come up with a new name for it? But if you show them a picture of, the desk and a kiosk and a lady, and you say, what would you do here? Then they might use some words like check-in or something else. And so there are ways of coming up with a more user-centered approach, even for things that are currently not automated. Over here?
We actually just went through something like that. I'll give you a brief example, but we have an app, we had a user that said, hey, I would like to send this to one of my friends, text or email to them. We said, okay, why don't we hit our share button? And he assumed that share meant share to Twitter, Facebook, or other social media. So he never hit it because he doesn't do those types of things.
Right. Yeah. And so all sorts of words have connotations to people already. So share, and we'll talk later about consistency. It's a really tough goal because there are all sorts of things you might be consistent with, right? And the classic example is the word copy, right? In real life, when you make a copy of something, you have two of them. But in computers, when you make a copy of something, you don't. You have an invisible version of it somewhere you can't see on the clipboard, and you have the original, right? And if you wanted two copies in a computer, you have to use duplicate. And that's just, kind of silly, but that's the requirement. And similarly, Facebook and all of these apps have already appropriated the word share to mean something else. And so that's what most people are thinking of because it's in the context you're building this app in the context of all these other apps that people already know about. And so that's, it really emphasizes this point that you're not just designing an app in isolation. You have to understand the context in which people are using it. So this slide is important. It talks about some of the distinctions between this method that we're talking about, contextual inquiry, and most of the methods that you're probably familiar with. So you're probably familiar with interviews, surveys, focus groups, right? Everybody's taken surveys on the web a million times. And the data that you get from those is summary data and abstractions. It's what people remember, what they say they want, and it's limited by their memory and what's salient, like we talked about. And it's also, what they think they want. And this is obviously important if you're a marketing person, right? If somebody thinks they want something and you can give it to them, then they'll pay money for it. So that's important. I'm not dismissing that as important, but it's different than understanding what they really need, right? And so the goal of contextual inquiry is to give you objective data about what really happens, okay? So it's quite a different goal, quite a different kind of information you're collecting. It comes from actual experience and concrete data. It comes from what users actually are doing and what they actually are having trouble with. Okay, so if a user is using a product and they get stuck, they're actually stuck, right? There's nothing subjective about the fact that they don't know what to do here. That's an objective fact, and you can bring that to your developer and say, look, on this screen, users don't understand what to do. We need to fix that because, and the goal is, the thought is, if somebody has an opinion, somebody else probably has the opposite opinion, right? If somebody really loves pink and somebody else is going to really not like pink and really prefer purple, well, that's their subjective opinions. But if somebody can't figure out how to use this dialogue, there are bound to be lots of other people who also can't use it, right? And there'll be some people who can use it, but the question is, how much of your audience are you willing to dismiss, right? If they don't like pink, well, they'll still probably figure out a way to use your product. If they actually can't figure out how to use this screen, well, then they're going to give up and use your competitor's product, right? And so the point is that even though for contextual inquiry you're only doing a small number of people, those people are representative of at least a reasonable percent of your audience, your target customers. And so anything that's objectively a problem for even one person is going to be a problem for other people, right? And this goes back to my audience is not like me, all these things we talked about before. I've been in lots of companies where we'll present a usability problem and they'll say, oh, that was just a stupid user, right? And it's like, well, we know that you're really smart and you wouldn't have this problem, but how much of our audience are you willing to just say should never use our product, right? If you're trying to sell a high-end, camera that costs $1,000, maybe that's fine to say, okay, we don't really want the consumers to try and buy this product. But if you're doing a consumer product for everybody, if you're doing a web page, right, you really can't afford to say, we don't want any stupid people using our product. And this data is spontaneous, as it happens, so they don't have to remember anything. And it really gets at this objective information about what people really need. So in this homework, you're just going to do one user. That's really not enough. Hopefully, if it's enough to teach you how to do this process. But if you were in a real company, you would not be doing this alone. You'd be doing this in little groups. And you'd do about 6 to 20 users. And that's a pretty big range. How do you know where to be in that range? A lot of it depends on the breadth of your market, right? If you have a fairly narrow market and you know your customers really well, you can say, well, let's take some people from our target audience. We can just do 4 or 5 of them. We'll really know what's going on with that target. If you're Google or Amazon or Canon trying to sell to the consumers, then you have lots of different kinds of customers. You'll need a much broader collection of people to look at. Do you want elderly people to be able to use it? Do you want young people? Do you want kids? Do you want handicapped? Do you want people from different nationalities who have different cultures, right? So there are all these different questions. Hopefully you have a good marketing department that can help you understand your target audience, right? And if your marketing department says everybody, well, then you should fire your marketing department because no product is used by everybody, right? And you really need to segment and understand better, you know, who this particular version is for, you know, what is the key, you know, certainly you don't want to eliminate people if they want to pay you money, but, you know, there's a bell curve, and who are the people who are your key target for this particular product or this part of the product or whatever. And important thing is that you're really looking at users here. And so this is actually often a problem that I've been in lots of companies that were interested in doing this, but the marketing people would not let the engineers and the usability people actually talk to real users. Because they said, oh, if the users get to find out who our engineering people are, then they'll just keep they'll keep calling them. Or the engineers will tell the users what's really happening, and that'll be bad. Or, you know, all sorts of excuses about why users and engineers can't be together. But it's really important for this task to really understand the real users, and so that's crucial. And there are lots of situations where the users are not the people paying money, right? So if you think of the kiosks for the airlines or the ATM machines or the supermarket, right? If you're the person developing the checkout thing for the supermarket, Giant Eagle is paying you money. Consumers aren't paying you any money at all, right? And so you have to sell it to Giant Eagle, but it doesn't help to test it on Giant Eagle. You have to test it on real consumers, on the little old lady from Squirrel Hill who has to figure out how to use this complicated machine, right? And she's not paying you as the vendor of that machine. I don't know who makes it, but maybe it's Symbol or something. So you have to try and get past your actual customer to whoever the consumer is that's going to be buying your product. And it could be that they're the same. If you're doing consumer electronics, like a Canon camera, obviously the consumer is the person buying your product. Other times it's not. And the interviewers, we talked about a little bit about the engineers actually going to see the interviews. Usually there'd be a user interface specialist because they're actually trained in how to perform interviews so that you get the most effective data out of them. So typically there's a small team, probably 2 or 3 people working together is optimal. I'm sorry that we can't really arrange that for homework 1, and you have to do it all alone, which is a lot harder. And which is one of the reasons that we say in the instructions that would be really good if you recorded them. Oops, come back. Nope. Yeah. So if we look at the instructions, it talks about taping a session, and so it's kind of like you can simulate being 2 people. That while you're actually doing the interview, the contextual inquiry, they're doing stuff, all sorts of stuff is happening, and you really want to take notes about all this cool stuff that you're learning, but then there'd be this big gap while you're writing stuff down and the user is just wondering what's going on. So it's really a good idea if you figure out some way of taping it, either with your phone, you can prop it up on a desk. It may be sufficient just to audio tape it. If you're doing a web page or anything on a computer, almost all computers have recording mechanisms where you can record the screen, which works out really well, and you can turn on the microphone and maybe even the camera, and just record the whole session so that you can go back later and pretend you're the second person who was getting to take notes. If anybody's having trouble, we have video cameras you can borrow, but no one's ever really needed that. But if you can't find some way to record, let me know. We can loan you something. So typically you'll have this little team, and ideally you'd have kind of representatives of a lot of different departments. Well, why is that? It goes back to this idea about designing from data and overriding opinions with data. That if you, there have been user studies where the consumers just break down crying because they're just so frustrated at how awful this product is that they're supposed to be using. There's some really great old videos of that kind of stuff. You can probably find some on the web too. And you know, programmers are kind of, you know, type of individuals who are known to be kind of nerdy and not care as much about people, but nobody really wants to make people cry, right? And so if you say to your programmer, look, the interface that you just delivered to me is making our customers cry. We really need you to fix that. That's extremely motivating, right? If you just said to if you're this user interface designer and you say to your team, look, really we need to fix this, it's going to take a lot of time, but it's really important, they're going to say, I don't believe you. It's really not that important. I think this is the best way to do it, right? It's way more compelling if you can show, you know, people are wasting a lot of time trying to figure out what this button means, or how to get to page 3 of our interface, or, you know, what did you have in mind for this part of the system? And to the extent that you can actually have the technical people in the room, or at least show them the video afterwards, then you get much more buy-in. And same with, you know, managers and marketing and all sorts of other people as well. So in a normal interview, things that you're kind of used to doing, where you ask people questions and they give you answers if you're doing a survey or an interview, you as the experimenter are really in charge, right? You get to control the conversation, you get to ask people what they want to do. This is kind of different. Here we're trying to engage the user and understand what they want and what they're doing, right? So we say it's a partnership where you're kind of being an apprentice, you're trying to learn from the user, right? And so you want to let them guide things, and you don't want to impose your assumptions and impose your beliefs about stuff, right? And so you really won't try to tell the user what to do, or tell the user how to do it, or ask leading questions like, isn't this an ugly color? Because, you know, things like that really result in your opinion, not necessarily their opinion. So the goal is to be very neutral and really understand what's going on in the user's head. So if you think of the user as being the expert and you being a novice or an apprentice trying to learn what the expert does or what the expert thinks, that's another way of kind of getting in the right mindset for your system. So it's really not the same thing as a conventional interview or where you're a consultant and you come in and get to tell people stuff, right? So you're not trying to tell the user how to do stuff. You're really trying to understand what they're doing. Another way of thinking about it is, you know, in the Middle Ages, when you wanted to learn how to be a blacksmith, you couldn't go to school for that. You had to actually watch the real blacksmith doing stuff. And so in this sense, you are the apprentice trying to understand how this user actually is doing their task or their activity that you're trying to understand. So how do you do that? The key is to let the user drive the activity. So you want them to, you know, do things in the way they normally do it, but you also are trying to understand what they're doing. And so it's not sufficient just to sit there and let them quietly work for half an hour, because then you won't learn as much as you could have. So what sort of things should you be asking? And the key is to think about how to ask these general questions that give you great information without biasing the people's answer, right? So you'll say things like, you know, what are you doing, right? Very vague, and they'll tell you what they're doing, or why are you doing that, right? What are you trying to achieve right now? If you see that they're confused or they just had an error, you can say, what did you expect to happen, right? And so you're trying to get them to tell you what they're thinking, what words they would have preferred to use, or what would you have wanted this to be called, right? Where were you looking for this feature if they're looking in the wrong place, right? And, you know, the goal is to let the user lead the conversation, but keep getting them talking so you understand what's going on, right? If there's ever a long silence, then you probably want to interrupt with, you know, what are you waiting for? What are you looking for now? What are you trying to achieve? And to the extent that they're confused about something, they'll probably frown. There might be long pauses, right? These are signals that you can pick up on that you wouldn't otherwise know. Another thing that this emphasizes is the difference between this and, say, weblogs, right? So if you're Google or Amazon or any web company, you're going to get these enormous logs of what everybody has done, and you can analyze all sorts of things very detailed, but you don't get any of this kind of information. From your weblogs, you can never figure out why somebody picked that button over some other button, or what they were really confused about. Or maybe you can know there was a long pause between this click and that click, but was it because the user went out to coffee, or because they were really totally confused about something for a few minutes, right? And so, it's definitely worth using all the data you can get if you get weblogs from your system that you're trying to evaluate. But that doesn't replace the kind of contextual inquiries that gives you this rich information about why. The key is why things are happening and what people expect. So we've mostly talked about observing people do stuff, and that's what you'll do in the homework as well. You'll get people to do stuff with your device and watch them. There's some times where that just doesn't quite work out, right? So if you're built a new surgery, or you're thinking about building a new surgery tool for surgeons to use in the operating room, and you want to know, what are their problems now, you're not going to be able to stand over the surgeon's shoulder and say, well, what are you trying to do right there? And let's have a little discussion now about whether that worked or not, right? Or a pilot, or maybe even a machine room operator, right? So that you're trying to build a new way of signaling alarms in a nuclear plant. So you'll say to your customers, okay, let's have a emergency so that we can see how that works out. So there are lots of tasks that are uninterruptible that just won't happen. If it's any kind of activity that involves that's very intermittent and you can't control when it happens, it's hard to. If it's extremely long, you won't be able to observe. So maybe this process takes a month. Then obviously you can't watch the whole thing. So what do you do about all these situations? And there's lots of alternatives that still get you to some level of objective information. You don't have to give up and say, oh, well, because this is too hard to get, we'll just give up and do a survey. One thing is the extent that you have logs or videos or some specific artifacts from the user, you can do what's called an artifact walkthrough. And this helps people remember exactly what happened. So you can, if you videotape the operation and you show the videotape to the surgeon, and then you can pause the videotape every few seconds and say, okay, well, what was the goal rate at this point? What were you trying to do there, right? And that because they're actually looking at something, that'll trigger their memory of what exactly happened there, right? Instead of just saying, what were your problems in this surgery? It's like, I didn't have any problems, it went fine. So I noticed right here that you seem to be upset about something. It's like, well, yeah, I just had this little issue with the tool. It wasn't working quite right, and I had to do this other thing. And maybe they wouldn't mention that unless you specifically showed them the situation in which it happened. So going through the artifacts that they produce is a great way of cueing them to remember things that are specific. And so there are a lot of different versions of that depending on what kind of thing they're doing and what kind of logs that you can create. Can you create a video, or maybe they created a tool or a picture. If you have a camera, you can say, look, here's a picture you took that was too dark. What was the situation in which that happened? What did you expect to happen? So maybe for a camera, you would go through the user's old pictures and see some that have problems, and maybe you can figure out specifics about what they had problems with or whatever. So there's lots of different ways of cueing people to get this objective data about what they're really interested in. And this also works for your question about, well, this is something that no one's ever done before. Well, can you come up with a situation that's similar enough that they can imagine it? Right, and so, it's also speaks, so in the assignment 3, you're going to take a prototype and put it in front of people and actually have them try out your idea for a new design. And so that's kind of another way of getting this kind of objective data, which we'll get to later. If you can't do a contextual inquiry, at least you can do a prototype study where you're going to get objective data about what people have trouble with on your prototype. So what do you need to do? As I mentioned, you need to record them. So even in real teams, in real companies, it's really useful to record them. A lot of times you'll just throw away the recordings because you don't need them because you did such a good job taking notes. But sometimes, and it often happens that after the third person you say, you know, I'm just starting to notice a pattern. It seems like everybody's having a little trouble over here. I wonder how long that was taking. And so then you might want to go back to your videotape of the previous subjects and actually measure how long things took. Maybe it didn't seem that important when only one person did it. But now that you've seen 3 people all have the same problem, all of a sudden that's much more interesting. And if you have a nice video of the original one, you can go back and look at it. And it's so cheap to take video today that you might as well just do it all the time. And then you can have it just in case you need it, right? Which actually brings up an issue that some people ask. It's like, should we turn in the video for the homework? And the answer is no, we don't want to see your videos. You know, we just want to see the information that you got from them. You want to be taking notes. Obviously, if you're doing this alone, it's a little trickier, but you know, do the best you can. In a real situation, typically one person is the note taker, and another person is the lead question asker, observing. You know, you're all observing, and so, and then a third person might also just be observing. So, you typically would have one person of contact who is the main person talking to the person under study. You would, in the real situation, you'd never go with less than 2 people because it's just too hard to take notes. And so we talked about this a little bit. You really want to know what people are saying. And so you want to record any great comments or issues that people bring up. You want to know what they do, you know, where they click, what choices do they make, how they say they're making those choices. You can often, while you're doing this, you're getting all sorts of great ideas, and you don't want to lose them. It's like, I bet if the search box was a lot bigger, then that would really have helped at this step. You're not going to ask that because that would bias the user. It's like, I notice you're having trouble with the search box. Suppose this was bigger. It's like, oh, cool, there's the search box. I was wondering where that was. So you want to try and not say these things, but you still want to capture them. So it's a great idea to write down your design ideas, but that's really not the point of the contextual inquiry. You're mainly trying to capture the breakdowns. You're mainly trying to capture what people are doing and what people are having trouble with. But to the extent that you think of cool ideas while you're doing it, you might as well write them down. It's silly to throw them away or lose them. So any kind of interpretation or new ideas would be great to capture as well. So what about analysis? To some extent, you know, you have multiple people. You can do some things right away. Other things you really need to do after the interview in little groups. And often the analysis will take 2 or 3 times as long as the interviews. So it's part of the planning of how you do these things that you will want to leave a lot of time. In this particular assignment, because you're having to do everything alone, it will take substantially longer than 2 times the amount of time you spend interviewing. So you should definitely take that into account. And why would you do this in a group? It's, you know, different people are going to have different perspectives on what was important about what happened or what you can learn from what happened. Hopefully what actually happened is objective and there's no argument about what actually happened. But what to do about it is obviously up for grabs. And so doing this analysis in a group creates this shared vision of the whole product team. It's like, well, now we have a great guide, a great goal of how we're going to solve these problems, of what we should do to make the users' lives better. So what about the tasks? So we talked about what are you going to have users do as part of this assignment? And it's really tricky to come up with really good tasks that make a lot of sense. And the other point that's really tricky is not giving away the answer in the tasks, right? So in real life, ideally, you would let the users pick their own tasks, right? So the whole point is to understand the user's real needs and what they really do and in what context they really are doing it. And so in real life, you would want to just go and let users do stuff and pick a task where you're using this part of the interface. Or if you're interested in studying only one thing, like the Indian Railway system buying a ticket, then you'd obviously have to have people who are actually trying to buy a ticket. So you might go to some place or situation where people actually do that. But it would be the user's own data, the user's own initiative to figure out how to do stuff and what they are doing about it. Unfortunately, here we're going to have to tell people to do stuff. And so the trick is to make it as real as possible. So if you're, say, doing, I don't know, nobody really picked an e-commerce site, so I'll use that as an example. Suppose you're doing Target or CVS, and you're going to have people buy aspirin. You're going to probably have to tell them, please buy aspirin, right? But you might say instead, suppose you have a headache, what would you do if you were going to buy stuff from this site, right? And so then you would see, do they know how to spell stuff? What do they pick? What would they call things? Which part of this website do they use? Do they go to the search bar immediately? If you say buy aspirin, they're much more likely to type aspirin into the search bar. If you say you have a headache, what would you do? They might say, look, here's a button that says headache. Maybe I'll click on that button and see if it'll tell me what to do about a headache. Or maybe they'll type headache into the search bar, and maybe that will work or maybe it won't, right? Because they don't actually sell headaches in CVS, but if you typed headache into the search bar, it might actually tell you what medicines are good for headaches, right? And so that would be a way of kind of guiding people to do something interesting without giving away the answers. And that's really the key in designing your tests. So they have to be kind of real in the sense of, you're going to build a product or a system for people to do real things. How real can you make your tasks so that what they actually do is informative, right? If what you tell them to do is nothing like what they'd really do, then it's kind of useless. And to the extent that you can, let people pick their own data for the task to see what they would say. So, again, if you're doing a camera, you would say, well, where do you usually take pictures? And they'll say, oh, well, I take some at home with my kids and sometimes outside. So we say, well, let's go do that. If you're doing a railway train tickets, you could say, well, where do you usually buy tickets to and from? How do you know what to do when you're buying tickets? And if they have no idea, or it's an American and they have no idea what the cities are named in India, then you'd obviously have to give them more data, right? So you want to give as little as possible, but if they don't have information like you would need to have, then you'll have to give them some. For the homework, we're asking that it be around 15 minutes for a novice. So again, this is part of picking a device that's hard enough. If an expert like you can do this task in a couple minutes, if you can do it in 10 seconds, it's probably too easy, right? Because even a novice is not going to have that much trouble with it. If it takes you a couple minutes to do the task, that's probably about right. It should take a novice or someone who doesn't know what they're doing like 10, 15, 20 minutes to do. In real life, it would probably be longer. You want it to be short enough that people actually finish. You don't want to take an hour of time. That would just be too annoying, especially for homework, you're not going to pay these people, right? So in real life, we have done experiments where we've made people sit for 6 hours and do some really complicated tasks, but in that case, we pay them a lot of money. And marketing companies actually will pay people to do complicated things. For this assignment, since it's much more limited, 20 minutes is kind of the max you can get away with. Question?
So did you mean, I I guess task in the sense that there could be like the ultimate task that you want to do, let's say register for something, buy something, or is it like small tasks within that task that you create a profile?
Right. So that's an interesting question about what level of tasks are we talking about here. So we're talking about contextual inquiry. There's another field called task analysis, where you actually try and make this whole hierarchy, like buy product is composed of 2 tasks, which is find product and register. And register is composed of these 12 tasks of entering all this stuff. And so there is, and actually the book has this big section about it that I didn't assign, called task analysis, where you actually try and make this graph or tree of all the tasks and subtasks. For this assignment, when I'm talking basically about the kind of everything, but in particular the high-level tasks. So if you're doing an e-commerce site, say Target again, you're going to say buy some medicine for a headache. And that includes finding out what medicine to buy, figuring out how to register or log in if I'm already registered, figuring out how to enter my credit card. And so every task can be subdivided into low-level tasks. In terms of this 30 minutes, that's kind of the maximum. I think the homework says 15 minutes. That's kind of the maximum that you want that person there. So that would have to be everything, including figuring out how to do it. Right? So if some subtask takes 15 minutes and another task takes 15 minutes, then eventually you're getting to be way too long. There are often people think it would be funny to use names that are funny or frivolous or offensive. So in the last class I just got out of, somebody used Donald Trump as the name for the pretend person. So pretend you're Donald Trump and enter this information. And probably some % of people would think that's kind of funny, but there's bound to be another % of people that think that's really offensive, right? And are really annoyed that you are denigrating this particular person. So kind of anything that you think is funny, somebody else is probably not going to think it's funny, right? And so your goal here is not to amuse people, it's to get real information. And so unless you really were doing a political site where it mattered, that you wanted the real Donald Trump, then don't use names like that, right? It's just as easy to use John Doe or Sam Smith or an ethnic name if you're trying to talk about somebody from a particular country or whatever. So think about trying to make sure that everything is fairly innocuous, that nobody in your target audience is going to be upset by it. Typically, like we talked about, you'll have a sequence of tasks, and it's usually a best idea to do the simplest one first. I mean, if it's an e-commerce site where probably there may be one task, which is buy something, then it would be reasonable to kind of just do this whole one task in a unit. But often there'll be lots of little tasks. First find a product using search. Okay, now see if you can find the same product without using search, because maybe you want to see if the navigation on your site makes sense. On a camera, you might say, okay, we'll just take a picture of me right now, right here, using the default settings, right? That's really easy. Okay, now take a picture of me with the lights off, where you try and figure out how to turn on your flash, and you also want to get this chair in the picture as well, or something more complicated later. So you kind of make a progression of easier to more complicated tasks to see, because if you put the more complicated tasks first, they may fail, they may, may take forever, and then you won't ever get any more information. So it's just kind of a general way of making it more useful. Let's see how much more we have. So there's another class in here directly afterwards, so we have to kind of end on time. I think I will cover the rest of these information in the next lecture on Monday. So you're welcome to read ahead if you want. But otherwise, we'll cover all the information you need to know for the homework then. I also wanted to mention we are going to have office hours for the TAs starting this week if anybody wants to know, and they'll be posted on the website.